One of those activities is raising revenue. The Nigerian government is desperately looking for ways to diversify its economic revenue base and increase non-oil revenues. But will that search for an increase in non-oil revenues lead to a change in power dynamics in the relationship between the government and the people? My next guest says that just might be the case in an article he penned. We're now joined by Dr. Nonso Obikili, Chief Economist at Business Day. You're welcome to the show, Nonso. In your article, you said, quote, that commentators seem to be forgetting that government revenue from oil works in a completely different way to revenue from regular taxes. Can you explain that difference?
Well, it's very straightforward. When you think of the oil industry, the governments collect the lion's share of anything that's produced. If a country exports $1 billion worth of crude oil, the government essentially collects maybe 70% in Nigeria's case. After you deduct taxes and after you deduct costs of production and other things that all companies take, the government gets the lion's share. But this is very different from other productive activity, right? If a farmer exports $1 billion worth of cocoa, for example, he or she is not going to hand over 70% of that to the government, right? He's going to pay taxes, or she's going to pay taxes, but she's not going to hand over everything. Same thing with exporting of manufactured goods or any kind of productive activity that is not resource-based. And so what you see now is that you find governments who are hustling to manage this collapse in crude oil prices, trying to redirect their attention to non-oil revenue, as they should. But non-oil revenue doesn't work in the same way. You can't go and extract the same kind of value from the productive economy that you could from crude oil. And so you need a lot more focus on how to get the non-oil economy to expand, as opposed to just how to collect taxes from the non-oil economy.
All right, thank you. Exactly. So that actually leads me to the next question. So essentially what you just said, so as a result of this, also you said in your article, you said that the source of tax revenue will now have to be increased with regards to making up that shortfall for what the government was collecting in oil. How realistic is that?
Well, that's a big challenge. It's not a short-term agenda, right? If you collected 70% of revenue from crude oil, and you want to collect that same revenue from the agricultural sector or entertainment or finance, then that sector needs to expand a lot more, right? Because you're collecting a smaller fraction. And so you need growth, you need strong growth in those sectors to replace the taxes that are lost from crude oil. And that is not a short-term agenda. We can see growth of, if we get growth of 7% in a year, that is counted as, very fast growth. But 7% in a year would not replace the lost income from crude oil. And so, in the interim, there needs to be some, I don't want to use the austerity word because that's not what I mean, but there needs to be some acceptance of the new reality that the governments may not have the same kind of cash that they used to have before. And it may not be able to extract that from the rest of the economy. And so we need to think about the rules that we give governments. Whereas we expected government to do a lot when they had all income, now that they're depending on tax income, we may have to think about what they should be doing and what they should not be doing. And again, that also counts, back here, with all income, government could do things like fund television stations or, unilaterally build infrastructure. But with tax revenue, it may not be able to do that. And so we need to think about how we are thinking of what exactly is the responsibility of government, now that we know that it has to transition to a tax-funded government.
Okay, so great. So does that mean a reduction in responsibilities? Because you made that point in the article as well about not expecting as much from government in terms of responsibilities because of this switch. Is that so? Are those essentially reduced or just changed to something else?
I think they need to be reduced. And you need to think of our history, where we're coming from. We're coming from a period, at least maybe not in recent history, but in the 90s and 80s, where all revenue was a lot. All revenue was maybe 20-30% of GDP, which means that the government had a lot of authority to do everything, almost everything that they wanted. It could fund universities, unilaterally fund healthcare, unilaterally build infrastructure. Now that's not the case, right? And so we need to think of Nigeria not as something that the government does for Nigerians, but something that we all do together. If you think of education, for example, it's pretty clear now that the federal government cannot unilaterally fund higher education, for example. So what other options are there? What else can we do? That's how we need to start to think about things. The past has already happened, for sure. But if we're going towards a future in which a government has to depend on tax revenue, then we have to give the government the opportunity to survive on its own. And we can't assume that the government will be able to do the same thing that it could do when it was flushed with all cash.
Great stuff. So the flip side of that, you're saying that governments ability to, quote, control the economy, does that now somehow shrink because of this?
Definitely, definitely. And for example, if you're depending on tax revenue and you manage to collect 30% of all output in taxes, which is a very high amount, that still leaves 70% with the party that actually produced the output, right? So just in terms of the power dynamics, if you think of money being power, in terms of the power dynamics, things are shifting because the people who actually produce stuff become more powerful, will have to have more say in government, will have to have more say in deciding what government actually does, as opposed to when we had a government that was dependent on all revenue and it could just do what it wanted because no one actually, it owns the lion's share of value in that case. And so I think what we'll see in the next few years is a transition in terms of the power arrangement, shifting more towards people who are actually productive, people who are actually producing stuff, and away from government unilaterally deciding things.
Okay, so does that then essentially suggest that accountability for government then increases? Does that become more of a real thing then?
Well, we hope it does. If you pay taxes, you pay 30% of your profits in taxes, you probably want to make sure that those taxes are spent more efficiently. You probably want to make sure that there's little corruption and there's more accountability. But again, it's not a given that will be the case, right? We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, now for the challenges we've been facing with taxing the informal sector, those challenges haven't gone away. I mean, how does one move forward there? Do you increase the amount of manpower with the tax collection agencies, or how do you see things on that side?
Well, I think we need much more fundamental tax reform. I think the tax structure that we have right now was designed for a period when oil was the main revenue source. And so the question was, how do you get this oil income? How do you distribute it, equally? Not equally, but almost equally. But now we're into a question of how do you collect taxes from most of the economy, and that is a completely different question from distributing oil revenue. And so I think we need to think about proper tax reform. One of the things that's possible is to have a federal personal income tax, which many countries have. It doesn't mean you have to increase taxes, but you can renegotiate with the states who actually currently collect personal income taxes to allow the federal government oversee the process and collect a bit of it. One benefit would be that the federal government is more likely to be able to enforce tax compliance, especially amongst high-income individuals. Another alternative is to rethink how we distribute corporate income taxes. Small businesses may not need to pay so much corporate income taxes to the federal government, but can they pay something to the states who are at the level, who are physically present, who can enforce compliance at that level? So these are the kind of questions that we need to ask. To be fair, we've done some. We've increased the VAT, which most people see as positive. And even within the VAT, there's much more room for improvement in the process to allow more firms into the tax net. So I think, there's no, with tax reform, there's no, solution. There's only what you agree to do. And I think we need to sit down on the table and try to agree on a new structure.
Awesome. Thank you so much for providing suggesting some solutions there. Now, in the article also, you pointed out that oil revenues for 2019 were about 2.2 trillion naira, yet personnel costs were about 2.6 trillion. And that was at an average cost of $64 a barrel for oil. We're at 30 now. Are we in for a pretty nasty or deep recession with where things are now?
Well, there's a positive and negative. The positive is that the government is actually a small part of the economy. Federal government spending, for example, was only about 6% of GDP last year, which is small, which means that the economy can survive and can go on even with that limited government spending. So it's not necessarily the case that if the government runs into financial difficulties, that the economy has to go with it. But of course, that depends on the policy environment. If we implement a policy environment that tries to extract tax revenue quickly from the economy, then the economy can go into recession for a long time. Now, in terms of the government's finances, it's pretty clear there's going to be a long transition period. I think the IMF projects that would have near record deficits for the next 5 years or so, which means that the federal government is expected to continue to struggle financially. That's pretty obvious because you cannot transition to a tax revenue base very quickly. You have to do it gradually. But I think it's not a given that the government's financial challenges have to plunge the economy into recession. I think the economy can continue to thrive while the government tries to fix its balance sheets.
Okay, thank you. And we think we've got about a minute left. The non-oil oil revenue projections have been slashed, yet non-oil projections for the government still remain, relatively high. Is that based on hope or based on a more aggressive push to collect those non-oil revenues?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. And for the last few years, I've argued that, our budgets have been essentially designed by, people who believe in miracles, because they looked unrealistic from the get-go. And so we are getting a bit now more close to reality. We are still a bit over-optimistic in terms of revenue projections, but at least we're not as over-optimistic as we were, 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So that's an improvement. But we need to start to get more optimistic. And if you look at last year's revenue, we still expect revenue this year to grow, by some 20%, even though we've seen what's happened in the global economy, we've seen what's happened to oil prices. If you compare the actual budgets to last year's actual revenue, and so there's still gaps there. All
right. Nonso, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. That's Business Day's Chief Economist, Nonso Obikili.